I was originally, when the panel was designed, going to speak on addiction. And after the developments of this particular case, thought that it would be important to address what it means and, the lessons, not just of the verdict itself and the struggle to actually have George Zimmerman get arrested, but the lessons of the mass movement that sprang up after the verdict. I think hopefully at some point we talk about the addiction as a disability in this country, as well as the treatment of people who are addicted, and especially in light of the fact that a great many people who are actually sentenced to prison in this country are sentenced because of drug offenses. However, it is important in political work to be flexible, and this week, after the verdict was rendered, it had a great effect and shook the entire country. For me and for many people, it was not a surprise. In fact, I had told many people, and we had many discussions in the party and the general, population. When you're talking to people, I had told many people that I did not think that they were going to find him guilty. And I didn't think that because the case was very much sabotaged by the prosecution. They did not want initially to arrest or bring any charges against George Zimmerman. And they did so, it was a concession that was made because they were afraid of what was happening on the streets. And you could see that, first of all, you had the judge herself who would not allow for, the issue of the profiling on the basis of Trayvon Martin's race to be used during the trial. And you had, the allowing of the animation to be used in the trial. I mean, anybody can come up with any scenario and use that. They could have come up with 100 different scenarios and played them for the jury, but that is not, in fact, what actually occurred. We have many different things that happened. The moments after the killing, the police going door to door and telling people, "Oh, you heard George Zimmerman scream, didn't you? Didn't you hear him scream?" Without actually asking them what they saw occurred and what they actually heard. So from the very beginning, they were actually poisoning people's minds who actually witnessed, either through sight or through sound, what occurred that evening when Trayvon Martin was murdered by George Zimmerman. We, as myself and I think any revolutionary that I've ever met, we're not immune to the visceral reactions that people have. Even those who don't regularly engage in political activity and people who may not have ever been to a rally or have ever organized anything, we're not immune to those because we're political. And for people of color, our reaction is very much from our experiences in life and those of our parents and our parents' parents. I'm sort of reminded by a couple of quotes actually from Che Guevara, and I want to say those before I go further. And the first one is that if you tremble with indignation at every injustice, then you are a comrade of mine. And the second is, a revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. This verdict itself is, I think we can all be in agreement, a great injustice. The murder of Trayvon Martin was a great injustice, and the verdict was a second murder of Trayvon Martin, and actually maybe a third, because throughout the process of this trial, they killed him and killed him again, over and over and over. In fact, and juror B37, I don't know if you've read that person's statements, basically said that he was responsible. So they tried him in abstention for his own murder, and it was just, if you watched it, I had a hard time actually stomaching it because I sort of knew what was actually coming. What I did not anticipate is the great reaction that occurred. I didn't anticipate that, to be honest with you, because the media had spent an entire year vilifying and criminalizing Trayvon Martin. And so they had poisoned the minds of many people, and even oppressed people. And so I didn't anticipate the reaction to be so swift and to be so mass. So when I say love, I think it's very, I don't mean that a romantic or personal love. I don't believe it's necessary to love every individual. And I really judge a revolutionary by the work that they do despite their personal feelings for people of our class. You don't necessarily have to like every person. What I think you need is a love for the class in general and for oppressed people in general, and that guides your action. Nor do I think it's necessary to hate all of those, every individual who exploits or oppresses people. We hate the ruling class in general, and we hate the exploitation of oppression of people. For instance, I have a landlord who's a slumlord, and he's a pig. He's a slumlord pig. But he's technically kind of a nice guy. He will come up to you and he will shake your hands and he'll speak very nicely to you. He'll ask how you're doing, but you have to struggle over him just to get water into the apartment. And the reason why that is because a person enters into that, being a landlord or a boss, not to do anything nice for people, not to provide them a living wage or not to provide them a comfortable place in which to live in, but to make profit. And in order to make profit, they will cut corners everywhere, or they will deny people their benefits, and they will fight against, workers fighting for higher and higher wages, because they, at the end of the day, what they care about is the bottom line and their profit, greater and greater profit. And so technically, I can say, do I hate my landlord as an individual? No. I hate him as a slumlord. I hate him because of his function, just like I dislike the function of pigs in the society, but they're technically some individually nice pigs. They'll be nice to you, and then they'll crack you over the head. But the verdict of not guilty, everybody remembers we live in a post-racial society. Well, the verdict belies that notion of a post-racial society. And in fact, President Obama's own words, and many people were waiting for him to say something. And I think that he must have been thinking about when he said that thing about Skip Gates. You remember that? And you saw his acceptance numbers just drop precipitously. And a lot of that were some people who actually voted for him, white people, good white people for them. But they say, oh, why did he bring up race and police brutality? And it became sort of, I call it the case of the haughty and sort of intellectual black president versus the working class cop. That's how they made it seem, right? And so how dare he attack this working class cop, and look at him in his high position, and he thinks he's better than us, and because he dared address police brutality and profiling of people of color. But if you have not read or heard his actual words, they were, Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago. And it's important to recognize that the African American community is looking at this issue through a set of experiences and a history that does not go away. He could have said a lot more than that. He could have said, this person profiled, hunted down, and murdered Trayvon Martin. And I'm sure in the back of his mind, maybe he was thinking that, probably not, but maybe he was thinking that. But his words himself, his words, you can take them, he's been attacked for them, a day after he actually said them. But it was a way of him saying, he said explicitly, those words really explicitly are saying that racism has not gone away. And that we look at this as a person of color, as a black person in particular, because not only because we feel it deeply, but because we know this type of racism. We see it in our everyday lives. I remember, I'm 36 now, but I don't like dogs. For people who don't know, I don't like dogs. And I'll tell you why I don't like dogs. It's not because I think the dogs did and took up in their own minds to do, they live on instinct, what they did to us as kids. But I don't like dogs for this very simple fact that as a child, my brothers and I and my cousins were walking once a week at least, and some white person would open their door and say, get him. And so I don't like dogs because my experience is having to run for our lives from these huge dogs being little kids. And this experience, it's not that I have lived my entire life as I've grown to be an adult having to run from dogs, but it's the experience of racism. It's feeling like you're less than a human being. And so that verdict that came down, you woke up in the morning feeling one way about yourself, and you went to bed at night feeling another. You see, throughout the lives of most black, if you get into a conversation, but I can say me in particular, I've had the experience, and many black people, feeling more or less black on any given day throughout a day. And see, it has its positives and negatives. For instance, when we were wearing the black medallions during the gold period of hip-hop, when the Zulu Nation began pulling out black medallions and people replaced their gold chains with black medallions, then I felt more black. When the LA Rebellion happened in April 19th of 1992, I felt more black and proud of being black. But the negative side of that having to do with how people view blackness, racist people view blackness in society. So every time I had to run from a dog, I felt more black, and I felt more black, and what I mean by that is that people who are racist and fascist and view blackness as being subhuman, I was living and feeling what they think of, how they think of blackness. I hope you understand what I'm trying to get at. And so when that verdict came down, I had that initial feeling. And many people of color had that initial feeling. It felt like someone said, your life does not matter anymore. It was like you could feel, I thought of those young children in 2008 after the election. If anybody was in Harlem, or you don't have to be in Harlem, anywhere where there are black people and you're walking around. And I remember 4-year-old kids, however tall a 4-year-old is, running and saying, we did it, without quite understanding what was done. And maybe it's because their parents explained it to them, but there was this great euphoric sense of this huge victory. It was a symbolic victory. And part of the struggle for black liberation, yes, was struggle for representation, even if it's not revolutionary representation or even progressive. And Barack Obama is a political moderate. But to have a young kid say, I can be president one day, was a major coup for a lot of people. And so, that was 2008, 5 years later. If you could talk to some of those same children after that verdict, what that would have meant for them, and how they could interpret it. And I thought about my gestating daughter, who's growing every day, and when we talk about her, we always, they associate the size of the, of the fetus with fruit and vegetables and things of that nature, and so now they say she's the size of a small cantaloupe. And so I say to my partner, how's the cantaloupe? She says the cantaloupe is doing just fine, and I can feel her moving. What I might say if she were, in fact, alive and walking around, how could explain that to her if she said, Daddy, how could they let him get away with killing that boy? And I'm sure that many black parents had to explain that. And they had to explain to their kid maybe the whole history. You see, this is so much bigger than Trayvon Martin. It's bigger than Jordan Davis, who was a 17-year-old kid who was shot in the car by Michael Dunn, a white man, at a gas station for playing his music too loud. It's bigger than Bo Morrison, who was killed in Wisconsin after a party was broken up by some pigs, and he hid out on somebody's porch and the guy came outside and shot him dead. It's bigger than Darius Simmons, the 13-year-old kid who was shot by his white next-door neighbor when Darius Simmons was taking out the trash, and he breathed his last breath in front of his mother. It's bigger than the 136 people, black people, who were killed last year by police agencies, and vigilantes like Zimmerman. It's bigger because our entire experience in this country is the experience of being a nationally oppressed people. That experience goes all the way back before we actually became one nation that shared these historical experiences. When we were many nations that had many different cultures, spoke many different languages, and through the experience of slavery and apartheid, became one nation through that experience that has the same goals, to see itself free from the oppression and racism that we suffer on a daily basis. And that continues to this day. I don't know if the 136 people that were killed last year is a larger number, and I always say that to people, than any other year prior. It represents the fact that because of technology, we are much more aware of these killings that happen in our communities by cops and vigilantes. And if you were to look at the years prior to 1965, when they stopped keeping records on lynchings, and lynchings still do occur. You just asked, I can't remember the brother's name, his first name was James. He was lynched in Jackson, Mississippi, I think last year, 2011, and beaten to death and run over by a car by some young white youth in Jackson, Mississippi. But the records of lynchings that occurred per year, and the first lynching of a well-known civil rights activist, just, a bit of history, was actually in Sanford. His name was Harry Moore. He was an NAACP activist, and he was murdered in 1955 in Sanford, Florida. But the numbers of people who were killed last year is probably very close. I don't think it's quite the same numbers of people who were being lynched since the end of slavery up until they stopped keeping records in 1965. So what was the actual response to that? I thought that there would be a response to the verdict, but I didn't think it would be so quick. That evening, after the verdict, and it was around 10 o'clock at night when the verdict came through, there were instant protests, not just in Sanford. There was a protest in a few hundred people in Union Square, Los Angeles, San Francisco. Throughout the country, people immediately took to the streets, not just black, but Latino, indigenous, Asian, and white workers as well, because they recognized this as a great injustice. There were many people in Hollywood even who responded to it. Miley Cyrus, of all people. I associate her with country music because her father, Billy Ray Cyrus, and I associate country music, even though country music comes from the country blues, which was thoroughly black, and has black roots, I associate modern day country music with racism. And this young woman is very progressive. Ellen Page, who said that people don't understand the feelings of oppressed people in this country. Oppressed people who aren't political don't use that word, oppressed people. They may say racism, but they don't use the word oppressed people. Saw it as an outrage. Kate Walsh, many Hollywood white celebrities saw this as a great outrage. And they were in solidarity with the black community. But the actions themselves, there weren't the mass rebellions. There were small rebellions, pockets of rebellions around the country. Los Angeles. But most of those did not start out as such. They started out as marches and rallies, and people got angered. They got angered by the police presence. If you were with us on Monday when we marched from Union Square, there were about 300 to 400 police. There were cops in cars, there were cops in paddy wagons, there were cops on mopeds, there were cops on motorcycles, and there were cops on feet. They had more police brass in one place that I've ever seen in New York. And these are the white shirts that have the bars on their collars. What they were basically there for, it was sort of, you had the injustice of the verdict, and then you had the injustice of being criminalized for expressing our anger and frustration at this verdict. So we weren't even free to express our political will without the police hampering us and hampering our movement and corralling us, and that is exactly what happened in Los Angeles of all places, where marches of people who were expressing their anger were encircled by the police. And that was where the response in most cases came from, is the police presence and the police abuse of people on the march. you see, I think that it shows for those who, it shows the response, not just the verdict. Because I think I think we're very much aware of what the verdict shows. But the response shows, it's not just, it springs from the conditions of oppression that people face, but it also springs from the other conditions of poverty, of unemployment, of lack of health care, lack of adequate housing, and all of these things. All of these things are part of the capitalist system, but also the fact that people of color, oppressed people, disproportionately face these things than the population in general. And so the expression of people after the verdict was an expression of being sick of all the manifestations of national oppression and racism in this country. And it shows that the response being so swift and being so mass in character, it shows that what is needed to go forward. You see, all these people who are talking about stand your ground, I think it's very, even in the states, there's 20 states that have a stand your ground law. I did an interview the other day. The other states have a very basic self-defense law. They have what's called the Castle Doctrine, which entitles you to kill somebody, shoot somebody for being on your property. But say that stand your ground was struck down and the Castle Doctrine was struck down, and you had the very basic bare bones, because they didn't use stand your ground as a defense for George Zimmerman. You have the very basic bare bones self-defense law that exists in most states, right? It entitles, and I think that there should be a right of people to self-defense, but we're looking at the United States, and whose right to self-defense is guaranteed. See, Trayvon Martin didn't have the right to self-defense. He was the one being followed, he was the one who was profiled, and he was the one who was attacked by George Zimmerman. He was the one who was approached by George Zimmerman, but he did not have that same right. Because if he had the right to defend himself, being the person who was chased down, he would have been the person. It would have been George Zimmerman who would have been found to have committed an illegal act and have murdered him. And in the case of Marissa Alexander, you can go through many different cases of people who weren't guaranteed the right of self-defense because of their nationality or the color of their skin. So even if the laws were struck down, and I think it's important to fight against some of the institutions that are championing these laws, such as ALEC, and such as Americans for Prosperity, and some of their racist founders and supporters like the Koch brothers, whose father was a co-founder of the John Birch Society. It's important to draw those things out and who these things benefit. But even if those laws were struck down, racism would still exist in this society. And racism would still exist because capitalism, at the end of the day, would still exist. And it is capitalism that needs the weapon of racism to keep working class people separate. And it is capitalism that needs national oppression because the capitalist system and the capitalist class understand that those who are the most revolutionary are those who have the most to gain. And the people who have the most to gain in a society such as ours are those who face the most severe forms of exploitation and oppression, and those are people of color in general in this society. So I believe that going forward, as we develop a strategy and talk about this case and talk about using this case to develop an action, to launch a movement forward, that we have to begin to develop something that is comprehensive, something where people have, such as they have done in Baltimore, where people who are oppressed and face these daily, indignities of life can trust in. Because people are feeling more and more that they can't go to the government that they may have elected because it does not represent them, that the courts don't represent them, that the laws don't represent them. And what recourse would you have then, other than to join in common cause with your next door neighbors and people just like you, with people who have the same interests with you, people who want to fight, who live the same conditions that you live under, and people who want to fight not in the same interest of you, who want to fight for you and fight for themselves and their other next door neighbors. And we have been developing the assembly movement because we think that the next wave forward is circumventing the bourgeois structures, the governmental superstructure that exists in the society that does the interests of the small, really fraction of a 1% of ruling class, of ruling people within this country. And they can take many different forms. It could be over something very simple that people organize with, but it's a way to empower people and develop their greater sense of solidarity amongst one another, and show that the only way to win, the really only way that you can win anything in a society, any game, is to struggle forward and to struggle with other like-minded people. I think it's important for people to see that. I think that the experience of Baltimore and the Baltimore People's Power Assembly, people see the great power of having that type of movement. And in Jackson, Mississippi, where they have elected Chokwe Lumumba, who is a stalwart in the national liberation struggle and is a revolutionary black nationalist, they were able to elect him by using the People's Assembly movement. And that's how they have waged their struggle, and they're expanding the People's Assembly movement through neighborhoods and hoping to expand throughout Mississippi as a way forward, not just in the interest of black people in Jackson, but in the interest of all people, all working people, and all other oppressed people throughout Jackson and throughout Mississippi. So despite the fact, and I will end here, despite the fact that we have suffered, and not just people of color, not just black people, but all working people have suffered this indignity of this verdict of allowing this murder to go free. It's the response, because what else do we have to look to now? Obviously, many people are fighting for the Department of Justice to file a civil rights case, but they'll only do that if there is actually a mass struggle on the street demanding that. And I think that and because of that, it is that movement that we saw that we have to look forward to wage struggle, and to make sure that this does not happen again. And if it does happen again, that justice, real justice, that we can't, in many cases, win in the courts, that we win through people's struggle. And I think that people are waking up to that every day. And I think that we have to take this idea to the masses and those who are struggling and fighting. And I believe, despite the great sadness that many of us have over what happened, that the fact that this sprung up so quickly, it bodes well for all struggles in the future. So, thank you.
Brian traveled to Cuba. In 1995, he attended the Second International Conference on the Right of People with Disability in Nevada. Brian will be speaking. First, we'd like to welcome Brian. Let's give Brian a welcome, Brian. Brian will be speaking on perspectives and strategies for the disabled liberation.
Well, comrades, sisters, and brothers, thank you all for having my wife and myself here, and for your hospitality. And in addition to Johnny's introduction of this event, it's a big part of why it happens around July 26th is also we wanted to mark, with the beginning of one of the greatest revolutions that has happened in human history. Whoops, let me get my notes, I can't read the thing. Okay. The Cuban Revolution we had started on July 26th at the Moncada Garrison. And, okay, if I can read my own writing, sorry. In preparing for today, I had I had started reading a speech by Fidel that he had given back in 1999 at the University of Caracas in Venezuela. And when the revolutionary process in Venezuela was first starting. It was on the theme of the battle of ideas. And this was a really intense time for the class struggle around the world. The Soviet Union had collapsed like 10 years earlier. The special period in Cuba had been going on, which, the Cubans had to take measures to preserve their revolution. And, but with all that, the global class struggle that was going on, that we suffered a lot of setbacks. Neoliberalism was ramped up a whole bunch after the collapse of the USSR. The bourgeoisie, you heard a lot of stuff going on about being put out about the end of history. Remember the end of history? I don't either. But yeah, Fidel was saying, Cuba still struggled on alone at a lot of times, and it felt like anybody who had any politics, it felt like people were struggling on alone. But Fidel was saying, because we believed in our ideas, they believed in the ideas, and they still reduced infant mortality by 30% in the middle of the special period. And that was only one of the things that they did. They graduated more doctors and medical specialists that they sent around the world in solidarity with the developing world. And the bosses, what the bosses had ideas, as ideas is nothing really new. Their ideas were just to loot everything and to privatize everything. That's when Milton Friedman, you couldn't go in a bookstore and not see Milton frigging Friedman everywhere. And that's when they still had bookstores. Yeah, but and the IMF and the World Bank were loan sharking poor and oppressed nations as they, at that point. And Fidel was still saying, even then, he's saying, our ideas are working. And he proved, and like I was saying before, this was when the revolutionary process was just beginning in Venezuela. And the gains that are being realized by Latin America, in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, and in the region, creating a pole, kind of a pole of attraction, is proving Fidel right, and so that ideas. I bring that up for a reason. Ideas just don't drop from the ideas just don't drop from the sky. They come from somewhere. Marxist axiom of being determines consciousness really applies here. There's a struggle going on between two irreconcilably opposed class camps that are described variously as the 1% versus the 99%, the job creators, remember them, versus the value creators, because our labor creates anything, any value that is created, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, the useless parasites versus the workers and the oppressed, or just the bosses versus the workers. There are lots of different ways, different arenas and different fronts on which these two class camps fight it out. They fight it out in imperialist wars. They fight it out in struggles around social policy, it's called, when the bosses want to reduce the standard of living of working people. So they slash wages, private wages and social wages, in terms of cutting benefits and things and living standards. And most of the time, we're just trying to maintain. And any victory that we're able to wrestle that's not just holding the line is very sweet in this period. So this is this struggle that's going on. This is where ideas come out of. The boss's ideas like racism and charity, and the boss's idea is racism. Our idea is racism hurts all poor and working people. Charity is their idea. Our idea is solidarity. We don't decide, look down on somebody, decide whether they're worth it before we're right there with people. Freedom, they always use the old thing of freedom, but it's always freedom in the abstract, and it always ends up being freedom to starve, freedom to I forget which bourgeois thinker said that the rich and the poor alike are free to live under a bridge if they want to, and our notion of freedom is freedom from poverty, freedom to be educated, freedom from being homeless, and real freedom. And their idea, their idea is patriotism, and our idea is class solidarity with the oppressed and the workers, as against our own bourgeoisie. And there are a couple of, in my talk, I have a couple of forums where this is playing, where there are different ideas that are playing out around disability issues specifically. Couple of months ago, you may remember that the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and it was, to watch the Senate debate, it was very tricky because it was a debate between two bourgeois ideals. First of all, that convention on the rights of people with disabilities, there are a lot of signatory nations to it, including Cuba. Vietnam, China, Venezuela, and these countries had provided input to the body that was composing the treaty, writing the treaty, and in terms of what the needs of each nation was, and what how this would affect the folks with disabilities in those nations, and what those nations would do to integrate the societies fully. But the United States, of course, voted against ratifying the treaty. The United States Senate voted against it. But the right wing, of course, did it for their neoliberal reasons. They didn't want the inclusion of folks with disabilities to cut into their profits. But the interesting part was the liberal bourgeoisie, the Democratic Party, the argument that they were advancing for ratifying the treaty is that if we had this, we can go in and tell these other countries how how to do it like we do it, how to do things. We can go in and we can use this as something to beat up on Cuba with, or beat up on China with, or beat up on Venezuela with, or anybody who their particular faction in the executive committee of the bourgeoisie didn't like at the time. And so there was really on that debate, that two sides of that debate, there was really nothing that was kind of weighing in from our class point of view. You heard from the Democratic Party, and then you heard from the Republicans. That was kind of it. That was where the but if that was just a snapshot of where things were at the time. But we look at what countries with much less resources than the United States are doing. But the way they organize those resources includes everybody. Cuba is a particular example. Venezuela is an ongoing example of how making opportunities for schooling, making opportunities for job training, medical care, in anything any kind of social wage in that society, making that available and accessible. So there's where you see the real war of ideas, the class line being drawn, the war of ideas on that. The other thing where you see the class lines being drawn is around the world there is, of course, there are struggles against austerity. There are Of course, here in the U.S., there are the attacks on Social Security that are ongoing. There are Detroit was just declared bankrupt, and there was put into it. They basically got rid of any democratic, any small d, any elected representation in the city to control. Any control of resources goes to, unelected, functionaries who were installed by bankers. What we have to, the task for us is to figure out, we're all working locally. I mean, that's the way it is. It has been during this period. We've been working locally, whether it's around personal attendance services in different areas. We've been basically holding the line against attacks on housing, personal attendance services, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. We are going to be, there are a whole lot of groups that are doing a very very good work in this, and it takes a long, that work is still going on. I will, keep my remarks brief, so I will let, if anybody wants to talk about any of the struggles that are going on here and nationally, that during the question periods and stuff that we can talk about later.
You didn't see that. I did want to mention one thing. Support disabled liberation. In this community, the word disabled, if anybody remembers, was, when? Right around 1981. And here it is, 32 years later. What do you see at parking spaces? What do you see in bathrooms? Handicapped. Try to find a disabled organization called Handicapped in the phone book. You won't find one. Oh, and aside from horse races, do you know where the word handicap comes from? See, during the Great Depression, which really, layoffs didn't really trickle down until 1932, right? The first people to start to lose their jobs was disabled people. And many, if not most, were forced to be on street corners, begging for money. You know how? Hand in cap. Hand in cap. Handicapped. That's why it's a derogatory term. And isn't it amazing that 3 decades later, we still have to hear this word. They still make new signs, even in hospitals. You go to NYU Medical Center, Bellevue. I go into the bathroom and I see a brand new sign, handicapped. I just wanted to preface that. I also wanted to say that I'm sort of changing a little bit of what I said in light of Trayvon Martin, because PTSD for Vietnam vets, a lot of it has to do with racism. It doesn't have to do with fighting some NVA soldier or, you know, seeing your buddy get killed. It has to do with racism and national oppression. Because if we don't fight national oppression, you can forget it. And I wanted to just say, though, that there are 3 things that I would recommend, 3 books. One is called Vietnam Veterans in Agent Orange, which is a compilation written by the National Academy of Sciences. The other one is an excellent book, actually, that deals with the propaganda through Hollywood about Vietnam. That book is called From Hanoi to Hollywood. And it's an excellent book. I highly recommend it. And the other one, hardly even known, and actually recommended by anonymous sources in the PTSD unit at the Manhattan VA, Shook Over Hell. And this particular book is about post-traumatic stress, Vietnam, and the Civil War. I'd like to mention, if I might, that one of the most damaging aspects of PTSD for Vietnam veterans is, in fact, the Rambo syndrome. The bullshit story, if there ever was one, boy. By the way, the script written by who? Some 24-year-old kid, the son of a music composer? Never spent 10 seconds in the military? Oh, Sylvester Stallone, huh? Where was Sylvester Stallone when we were in Vietnam? Nowhere! But they want to propagate this myth about being spit on, pissed on, we hear. I'm going to tell you something. I used to be Junior Vice Commander of Chapter 126, Disabled American Veterans. I've heard from Vietnam vets, oh, you know, when I came back, oh, you know why? They've been conditioned by these films. I was spit on, I was pissed on, I was this. You know what I do? You know what I tell them? Okay, where? When? Where exactly did this happen? Not once could any of them say, oh, they'd say, well, I don't really mean that. Oh, you know, it did not really happen, but, you know, it was just that kind of way that we were treated. You want to know something? In 1986, the Veterans Administration actually did a survey of how Vietnam veterans were treated. Now, for me, the first thing I did when I came back from Vietnam, I joined 2 organizations. The American Servicemen's Union, which was an anti-war organization within the military of active duty GIs and Vietnam veterans against the war. Some of whom members are right here in this audience. Right, Joe? That's right. This is one of the biggest fallacies and myths. See? And the reason why they do it, and let me just tell you how damaging that is to soldiers. They don't care about soldiers. They don't care about GIs. They want to wave the flag while they take away veterans' benefits. And you know what they'll replace it with? A nice wreath for the 6 o'clock news that costs $32. That's what they want to replace it with. No thanks, Mr. Stallone, Mr. Chuck Norris. You know, give me a break. The other thing I'd like to mention also in relation to this is the myth of veterans being disrespected. There actually used to be an organization, another organization, called Honor the Veteran, Not the War. And in the VA survey in 1986, 77% of Vietnam veterans surveyed said they were treated with respect by all stratas of society, as they put it. And another 15% said somewhat treated with respect. So let's see, 77 and 15. I'm not too good in math. Doesn't that come to 92%? This is the biggest line of BS, and they hit it, and you hear it over and over and over again. It's like Goebbels. Or as Gertrude Stein once said, if you want people to believe something, repeat, 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 and repeat. I've been in the PTSD program in the Manhattan VA for 17 years. Most of the veterans in the Manhattan VA PTSD program are veterans of color. Might be a little bit different than maybe some other parts of the country. But I can tell you this, that these veterans, and in light of Trayvon Martin, are furious. Furious. Oh, you know, he was on top of the guy. Really? George Zimmerman, excuse me. Cold-blooded murderer. He's a murderer. The jury, what did they issue? They didn't issue a not guilty verdict. They issued a license to kill children of color. Why do I mention this? Because I'll tell you a story about Vietnam and about racism and about post-traumatic stress disorder. When I was in Vietnam, and I wasn't really very political, I wasn't. There was a group of us white GIs who just sort of hung out, didn't think much about it, hung out with African American, Hispanic GIs, just because we could relate. It wasn't even like necessarily a conscious, like political decision. And I can tell you this, you know what else is not talked about? How many veterans of color were murdered in Vietnam by racists in the military? Oh yeah, oh yeah, you won't hear about it. You hear about it here. You hear about it in Workers' World, you'll hear about it. And I'll tell you this story. Guys like Sam Jones, J.T. Campbell, J.J. Felton from Chicago, Howard E. Howard from Gary, Indiana, saved my life. And there's actually two different kinds of saving your life. There's the ones who save your life, and then there's the ones who risk their own life to save yours. And I actually became a victim of a plot to be murdered, along with another handful of white GIs who were considered traitors. And guess what? You know that the African American soldiers, do you know what they did? They got wind of it. Mr. Naive here, you know, I wasn't even thinking about it at the time. You know what they did? I'll tell you what they did. While we slept, they didn't. They kept watch on us and told, I found this out later, told these racist forces, you touch Imperato, you touch Richardson, you tell Bloomfield, and two of you will get it in return. Can you imagine a loyalty like that? How could anybody ever betray anything like that? So why do I say that? That's my PTSD. I've had it ever since. And to tell you the truth, the best therapy I ever had was joining Workers' World Party, which I joined even before I got out of the military. And the reason I mention this is to break the mold, to break this conditioning, this crap that is perpetrated. The Vietnamese, let me tell you, you want to talk about how the Vietnamese dealt with the national question? They'd put up signs in English off the perimeter, outside the outer wire, because you always had an inner wire and an outer wire. You know, kind of a thing with to do with a base camp. And you know what those signs said? African American soldiers, the sons and daughters of slaves. Why is it in your interest to fight us? Some of those signs even said, listen to Muhammad Ali. Oh yeah. And I can tell you this, that many soldiers gave their weapons to the Vietnamese. I could tell you a lot of stories. Oh my God, I've been talking 12 minutes already.
You're good. Sit on the chair.
The point is that so many of the veterans, for instance, in my group, they're being treated because of racism. Racism that they suffered in Vietnam, racism that they suffered in the military when they came home, and post-traumatic stress disorder that they suffer from every time they see this garbage perpetrated, television, radio, TV, oh, the disrespect. And you know what? This is a propaganda machine. And that's why I'm saying this today. Because I can tell you this, my children look like Trayvon. How do you think that PTSD affects me? You know how it affects me? We call it the rage. You're looking at it right now. The rage. It's not about me as a person, as an individual. It's about us. It's not about I. It's about we. And what they do is divide and conquer. From Willie Lynch, that's where the word lynching comes from, who said, oh, you know, treat the lighter skinned ones a little better, or let's have the Marines fight in the Air Force, or the Navy fight in the Army. Divide and conquer, or as we call it at the VA hospital, D&C. So I would like to recommend those following books. And of course, listen, if anybody wants to inquire further on this, 15 minutes, please feel free to do that. And I would like to say this too. You hear figures about post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, according to the post-traumatic stress disorder unit at the Manhattan VA, 80 to 85% of any soldier in a combat zone suffers from some form of post-traumatic stress disorder. And you know what? Well, I got them right there, all the medications that they give me. It looks like Dwayne Reed, you know. But you know what the best medication is? Right there. Right there. Seriously. So comrades and friends, thank you for your time. And Let's get about the business of relegating this disgusting, racist, sexist, misogynist, homophobic, genderphobic capitalist system into the trash bin of history where it belongs.
You know, I ran across this article in the Times about 6 months ago, and it must have been pretty important because it was on the front page of the Science Times section. So it was the lead article, and it says, "Ancient Bones That Tell a Story of Compassion." So let me just read you some quotes from it, because I think it's relevant to our discussion. It said that they found the bones of a profoundly ill young man who lived 4,000 years ago in what is now northern Vietnam. He had fused vertebrae, weak bones, and other evidences that he was disabled. He had become paralyzed from the waist down before adolescence, the result of a congenital disease. He had little, if any, use of his arms, and could not have fed himself or kept himself clean, but he lived another 10 years. Now, this is a Stone Age culture. They concluded that the people around him who had no metal and lived by fishing, hunting, and raising barely domesticated pigs took the time and care to tend his every need. Now, the article continues that, then this is news. Gee, you know, didn't we think that Stone Age people they threw away their disabled, they dragged their women by their hair, they were barbarians? Well, this is news. This is something different. At least it's news to the Times, you know. Says this case and other similar cases of what appears to be care for the sick and injured reflect a different view of primitive cultures, so-called primitive cultures. Not only does the care of this person indicate tolerance and cooperation in his culture, but suggests that he himself had a sense of his own worth and a strong will to live, without which the anthropologist have found that says he could not have stayed alive so long. They refer to about 30 other cases in which disease or pathology was so severe that the people must have had a lot of care in order to survive. And it goes on, and it goes on to different cultures, to Florida, to Europe, to Neanderthal culture, across the board. And they're starting to define kind of an anthropology of healthcare. But gee, this is very contrary to what we've seen, you know, or what we've heard. And it bears examination of exactly what disability has meant at different times. I think, well, we feel in this society that if we have a disability, and I'm dyslexic and I'm hearing impaired, that the system wants to throw us away and we have to fight for our survival, particularly now, but generally that's the way it's been. I mean, the Americans with Disability Act, my God, what huge struggles that involved. You know, for years and years and years, and then there were other instances in the 30s of huge struggles. The trade unions, you know, as soon as trade unions formed, they took on the whole issue of safe working conditions and rights for those disabled on the job. It's always been a fight against the system. Well, here we're seeing something that's different. Another book that I found very interesting is called A Disability History of the United States. It starts with what indigenous people here thought about disability. This is indigenous people around the world. So what we're seeing is a different kind of culture that existed previously everywhere. And we can go here to the Iroquois Confederation. And there's a story about indigenous cultures pre-1492, pre-Columbus, that was carried down in the Iroquois Confederation, which is a confederation of different tribes. A Huron man brought the great laws of peace to the Iroquois, a pathway to restore peace, compassion, and righteousness, and a way to develop the strengths necessary to live out the law. He went to all the nations in the Iroquois Confederation. And one day when he was teaching the Mohawks, a sad man came who had lost his entire family. The peacemaker, who was considered a very great man, consoled him. In fact, he had been waiting for him. This man was to become the peacemaker's interpreter or spokesperson. And this was needed because the peacemaker had a stutter, which made it very difficult for the people to understand him. And with this man, the peacemaker reminded the people of the Iroquois of the need for harmony. In traditional cultures, it was believed that everyone had a gift or a skill, an ability or a purpose. And when individuals, communities, and the world in general was in harmony, individuals shared their gift and benefited from the gift of others. The concept of disability is profoundly shaped by social factors. Most pre-Columbus indigenous communities had no word for disability. If someone with, say, a cognitive impairment, and I don't even like to use that word, but it's used now, was a good water carrier, say like somebody who had, maybe couldn't remember everything all the time, was a good water carrier, that person, that was his gift, and it was appreciated. There was no stigma attached, and he or she was loved and welcomed. People were not defined by either their ability or their disability, but by their contribution to the whole. For instance, this person who maybe couldn't remember that well, but was a good water carrier. Maybe this person in the tribal councils, when they told the old stories, maybe this person had so much enthusiasm each time that everyone loved him because he kept the story so green to them. Or maybe this person was the one, if this was a tribal society where they were nomadic and relied on the buffalo or something else, maybe this person is the one who sensed the change in the weather that would predict that the buffalo were going to come. People were appreciated by what they did and the wholeness of their personalities. The closest thing to the word disability in sub-tribes was a relational term. When someone lacked community relations or had weak community relations, or when the person was removed from or unable to participate in community reciprocity. We might call this alienation, that if you were alienated for a society, that was a disability. This was a very sophisticated and compassionate society and a sophisticated and compassionate concept. Now, wait a minute. Didn't we hear that it was civilization that brought compassion? Well, let's look at civilization and see. Civilization, as it's recorded in the history books, is the beginning of class society, the exploitation of one person by another for some kind of material gain and the making of profits. As Ryan said, there's the 1% and there's the 99%. Under the system that we have now, capitalism, this alienation, which the indigenous people call a disability, is built into the system. The social alienation starts with a working person's alienation from their own labor, because you work for the boss and so much of what you produce goes to the boss. You don't have it anymore. If disability in pre-1492 indigenous culture is defined as alienation, how is disability defined in the 20th and 21st centuries under capitalism? Disability is defined as the inability to toil for the boss so he can extract surplus value from you. It is essentially the boss's definition. The class that is the most alienated from society in reality, right? But calls most of the shots. And the label of disability, anything with a dis in it, right, is not a good label, carries a stigma and shame. Under capitalism, the working people have the highest levels of disability due to unsafe working conditions or poor or non-existent health care. Disability injuries with no safety or compassion was the rule in the industrialization of the U.S., the very process that brought the super-rich their wealth. It's hard to exaggerate the impact of mines, steel plants, railroad yards, textile factories, lead poisoning, speed-up assembly lines and repetitive motion on the bodies of men, women, and children, and the accidents that meant greatly diminished or no income for whole families. Sometimes companies promised compensation, but they never gave it unless there was a workers' struggle to fight for it. An 1890s estimate was that 42% of Colorado railroad workers were injured on the job every year. When racism was added, it was certainly worse. Chinese immigrants who built the transcontinental railroads regularly lost fingers and hands both to hammers and explosives and then were thrown on the scrap heap. In a culture that's dominated by profits above all else, every attempt was made to blame working people for their own poverty and injuries which arose. We weren't careful enough. We weren't awake enough. Sometimes the framework of disability was used to justify not only the oppression of people with disabilities, but class oppression, racism, and women's oppression in this alienated society, to create divisions, a hierarchy, to justify the status quo. Working people are mentally deficient. That's why they're well suited to work with their hands. In the early 1900s, women could not work and have children. It was too much of a strain. It might make them hysterical. Black people were ideally suited for slavery, and freedom led to more than one case of insanity. That was said after the Civil War. There are differences and special needs among all of us here, many of us here, and the population as a whole. But under capitalism, there is a social question of disability. And this is why, inspired by the civil rights movement and the national liberation struggles, the whole disability rights movement developed in the 60s and the 70s. And this is a definition that was developed of disability at that time. Disability is a social condition of discrimination and unmerited stigma which needlessly harms and restricts the lives of those with disabilities and results in economic disparities, social isolation, and oppression. Is from this book. Now, we could give a lot of examples. I think a lot of people have here and will, you know. I don't want to take up too much time, so I'm not going to go into some of them. Let me just skip. Let me just mention the autistic students, because I don't think we have a speaker on that. According to a recent study published in Archives of Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine, autistic students face far more bullying. So much so that the author of the study calls it a profound public health crisis. According to the UN, people most at risk for abuse are women, children, and disabled people. Not only are people with disabilities oppressed and super exploited, we are still being blamed. In the last election campaign, Mitt Romney, in a private meeting with rich donors, and this applies to not only to people with disabilities, but people like myself who are retired, and anyone who was worked for and deserved any kind of federal monies, Mitt Romney said he dismissed 47% of the population as taking no responsibility for their lives and for thinking they are entitled to government handouts. Sounds like he was talking about the banks. That would be the reality of it. No responsibility and thinking they're entitled to government handouts. Also, the federal government has laws which exempt minimum wage for companies who employ disabled people. Look at that. Look, talk about super exploitation. Those laws are still in the books. They'd like to do that to everybody. I think Brian explained well that we look to socialism and the examples of socialism, because those of us here, we will continue fighting this system for our rights and the rights of others. We are your brothers, your sisters, your parents, your nephews, your aunts, your uncles. We are in this community. We're talking about disabled rights right now, but we're talking about the struggle against racism. We're talking about the struggle against sexism, for LGBTQ rights, everything. You just have to constantly fight this system, because the system is not our system. But ultimately, we have a perspective on how to change this. And it's to smash the system based on exploitation and build a socialist system so that we can go back to the values of the classless society, which our indigenous brothers and sisters have shown us. The values of respecting everyone's gift, of not judging, and of living in harmony without class conflict, all as equals with each other.
Laws still stigmatize the so-called mentally ill. Who's to blame for most gun violence when they are the most likely targets of violence? Eddie.
Good afternoon. I identify myself as a person with a disability. In 1975, I was medicated with antipsychotic medications, Moban, Mellaril, and haloperidol, causing serious side effects, including drowsiness, disorientation, uncontrollable shaking, inability to sleep, and unusual sensitivity to heat. After 6 years, another psychiatrist advised me that, like millions of others, I had been misdiagnosed. I had discussed this with Workers' World Party member Betsy Gimbel, Secretary of Disabled in Action. I had discussed with her my experience with the antipsychotic medication. Betsy, who died in 2004, led the fight for access to mass transit for the Betsy, who died in 2004, led the fight for access to mass transit for the disabled, including securing wheelchair lifts for New York City buses. Betsy told me that many people with my experience considered themselves emotionally disabled and not necessarily ill. I felt wonderful when Betsy said that. The term sicko or just sick is one of many derogatory terms often used against people with emotional, psychiatric, and mental disabilities. Betsy invited me to participate and join the Workers' World Party Disabled Caucus at the Disabled Workshop in the historic All People's Congress in Detroit in October 1981, as I identified myself for the first time as a person with an emotional disability. I am proud to announce that the Workers' World Party Disabled Caucus is reconstituting itself as a caucus of comrades with disabilities in order to work together with our existing Committee on People with Disabilities, who organized this forum, to better intervene in and demonstrate its solidarity with the disabled liberation movement here and around the world. In my union, CWA 1180, my union cap, which represents more than 8,000 New York City administrative workers, more than 80% of whom are people of color and more than 80% of whom are women, I am co-chair of our union's Committee on People with Disabilities. When our union, when our union was planning a seminar on the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, whose anniversary we're commemorating today, I found that our handouts on disability etiquette omitted several important types of disabilities, including mine, which I call emotional, mental, or psychiatric, and others call mentally ill. I expanded and rewrote the disability etiquette section, which will be part of a new pamphlet to be published soon by my union. It's on the lit table and it was put on everyone's seats. It is a living and evolving document which we invite you, especially people with disabilities, to comment on, as we are the best spokespeople for our own disabilities. Some people in the disabled community are now using the term so-called mentally ill. According to a June 26, 2013 Wall Street Journal article entitled "Unspecified Mental Disorder, That's Crazy," by physician, psychologist, and author Dr. Leonard Sachs, the American Psychiatric Association released a revision of its Diagnostic Bible in May, the first major rewrite in 2 decades, the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-5. It's the official guidebook for diagnosing every conceivable psychiatric ailment. First published in 1952, it branded LGBTQ people as having sexual orientation disturbance until its 3rd edition in 1980. In previous editions, the patient had to meet certain specified criteria in order to be diagnosed for any particular condition. For schizophrenia, then you had to have specific symptoms, such as delusions or hallucinations. If you didn't have those symptoms, you would not qualify for a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Not anymore. Last month, DSM-5 introduced a new diagnosis, unspecified schizophrenia spectrum disorder. The only required criterion is that you have some distress from unspecified symptoms, but that you do not meet the full criterion for any of the disorders in the schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders diagnostic class. This diagnosis is on one short paragraph at the bottom of page 122 of the DSM-5. There is also a new unspecified attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The pièce de résistance of this glorification of ambiguity is on page 708, where you can find the new one-size-fits-all mental health diagnosis, unspecified mental disorder, if you do not meet the full criteria for any mental disorder. As recently as 1994, it was rare for any child or adolescent in the U.S. under 20 years of age to be diagnosed as bipolar. There was a 40-fold increase in the diagnosis of bipolar disorder among American children and teenagers just between 1994 and 2003, without any change in official diagnostic criteria. Most of the new diagnoses were for children under 15 years of age. This phenomenon is peculiar to North America. During roughly the same period, the proportion of children under 15 diagnosed with bipolar disorder in Germany decreased. In the United Kingdom and in continental Europe, bipolar disorder is still recognized as a condition that cannot be reliably diagnosed in childhood. According to Dr. Sachs, quote, "Kids have mood swings. Mood swings in an 8-year-old do not signify bipolar disorder. Mood swings are a normal part of being an 8-year-old, unless you happen to live in the U.S., in which case your child is more likely than ever to be put on powerful antipsychotic medications." Psychotherapist Gary Greenberg, in the Book of Woe, The Making of the DSM and the Unmaking of Psychiatry, recounts how Joseph Biederman, a child psychiatrist at Massachusetts General Hospital, decided in the late 1990s that some children he'd been asked to treat for particularly severe attention deficit hyperactivity disorder were in fact suffering from bipolar disorder, or BD. BD, a serious, probably genetic and lifelong condition, had previously been thought to emerge in early adulthood. It is often treated with powerful mood-stabilizing drugs with significant side effects. although there were no substantive studies supporting the existence of pediatric BD, and his child patients did not display one of the key symptoms of manic episodes, Biederman used his considerable prestige to advance his theory. The 2000s saw a boom in pediatric diagnosis of BD and the prescription to young children of medication that carried risks of cataracts, diabetes, obesity, and a movement disorder called tardive dyskinesia. In 2006, a scathing front-page expose in the New York Times revealed that Biederman had received $1.6 million from drug companies in exchange for promoting his diagnosis, and solicited even more to fund research that he promised would support the safety and effectiveness of their drugs. This speaker recognizes that people with and without disabilities have been helped by the treatment of psychiatrists and other mental health professionals, but that the capitalist system, which puts profits before people, encourages and promotes abuse of patients and discourages nurturing scientifically sound patient care. Witness the public health epidemic of hospital closings in New York City. I believe 4 targeted for shutdown in Brooklyn alone. And for years, health insurance companies have consistently paid a much lower percentage of patient medical costs for psychiatric care than for other medical treatments, making quality psychiatric care more of a privilege than a right, and much more affordable for the 1% than the 99%, as its cost is beyond the economic means of many workers and oppressed people, particularly people of color. What does all of this have to do with gun control and the so-called mentally ill? On December 14, 2012, 20-year-old Adam Lanza shot 20 children and 6 adult staff members in a mass murder at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. The shootings prompted proposals for new legislation banning the sale and manufacture of certain types of semi-automatic firearms and magazines with more than 10 rounds of ammunition. Almost immediately, New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo took advantage of the hysterical climate after Sandy Hook by drafting the Secure Ammunition and Firearms Enforcement Act, or SAFE Act, in secret, and moving it through the legislature, according to the June 24th Chief Leader newspaper, faster than a speeding bullet. He invoked a message of emergency, which allowed the legislature to skip the normal 3-day waiting period before a bill could be considered. So it was passed on January 15th, with no hearings, no public input, and minimal debate. The SAFE Act forbids the possession, except by actively employed law enforcement personnel, of magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. The maximum number of rounds, it says, can be loaded into a magazine is 7. Standard weapons used by law enforcement officers actually use magazines holding up to 15 rounds. On June 21st, the New York State legislature even amended, on July 8th, Governor Cuomo signed an amended New York SAFE Act, which now exempts police retirees from limits on magazine sizes. In other words, cops and retired cops have free rein to use these semi-automatic weapons, which nobody else can have. What got less publicity was Section S20 of the New York SAFE Act, which required mental health professionals, including any physician, psychologist, registered nurse, or licensed clinical social worker who currently believes a person they are treating is likely to engage in conduct that would result in serious harm to self and others. They must report such individuals to local law enforcement authorities. Every year, my union participates in the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, or NAMI's walk across the Brooklyn Bridge and in many other New York cities to stamp out the stigma of mental illness. In NAMI's April 2013 newsletter, an article featured by a BBC writer asked the alarming question, will gun laws hurt the mentally ill? The reporter interviewed a woman who he described as someone who has battled mental illness since she was a teenager, who said, if I had the fear it would go to the police, I would feel violated, like Big Brother is watching me. Professor Paul Applebaum, Director of Law, Ethics, and Psychiatry at Columbia University, has complained that the law provides no guidance to mental health professionals. So the requirements to assess if someone constitutes a threat are just as unclear as that for psychiatric diagnosis. In fact, in July 2012, the American Psychiatric Association Assembly and Board of Trustees issued the following statement, quote, "This position statement was proposed by the work group on violence risk of the Council on Psychiatry and Law. During their careers, most psychiatrists will assess the risk of violence to others. While psychiatrists can often identify circumstances associated with an increased likelihood of violent behavior, they cannot predict dangerousness with definitive accuracy. Over any given period, some individuals assessed to be at low risk will act violently, while others assessed to be at high risk will not." On May 1st, 2013, Wendy Brennan, Executive Director of NAMI New York City Metro, testified at an NYU Langone Medical Center forum that the New York Safe Act's duty to report provision will not prevent violence and will not save lives, but will inhibit some from seeking the vital mental health services and treatment they need. According to a 2006 American Journal of Psychiatric study, only 5% of violent crimes defined by the FBI as murders, robberies, rapes, and aggravated assaults can be attributed to people with mental health problems. Yet there is a strong belief in this country that people with serious mental illness are dangerous and are responsible for a significant amount of the violence in this country. Another 2006 survey indicated that the so-called mentally ill are 12 times more likely to be the victims of a crime than they are to be the perpetrator. Who is gun control for? In 1940s Jim Crow, Georgia, Lena Baker was the African-American mother of 3 children and worked as a maid to support her family. In 1944, Lena started working for Ernest Knight, a white grist wheel owner who held her there for days at a time against her will. One night they had an argument in which he threatened her with an iron bar. She tried to escape and shot and killed him with his own gun. She immediately reported the incident and said she had struggled in self-defense. The all-white jury convicted her of murder by the end of the afternoon. Because African Americans had been disenfranchised since the turn of the century in the South and could not vote, they were disqualified from jury service. On March 5, 1945, Lena was executed in Georgia's electric chair. The Mulford Act was a 1967 California bill prohibiting the public carrying of loaded firearms. At that time, members of what was then known as the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense started their community police patrol programs. Members of the Black Panther Party would listen to police calls on a shortwave radio, rush to the scene of the arrest with law books in hand, and inform the person being arrested of their constitutional rights. Panther members also happened to carry loaded weapons, exercising their constitutional rights to bear arms, which were publicly displayed, but they were careful to stand no closer than 10 feet from the arrest so as not to interfere with the arrest. Passage of the Mulford Bill would essentially end the Panther police patrols. So the Panthers sent a group to Sacramento, California on May 2, 1967 to protest. The Panthers carried loaded rifles and shotguns, publicly displayed, and entered the state capitol building to read aloud Executive Mandate Number 1, which was in opposition to the Mulford Bill. Unfortunately, the legislature then responded by passing the bill, thus creating the Mulford Act, which was signed into law by Governor Ronald Reagan. Soon after this incident, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover declared the Black Panther Party to be the single greatest threat to the national security of the United States, and police departments across the country murdered Panther leaders like Fred Hampton in Chicago. On July 31, 2010, an African-American woman, Marissa Alexander, who had given birth days before, fired what she described as a warning shot in the air during a fight with her abusive husband. 2 children were inside their Jacksonville, Florida home when she pulled the trigger, but no one was harmed. Alexander claimed self-defense under Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which supposedly allows citizens to defend themselves when attacked. But a judge rejected that argument. Alexander was convicted of aggravated assault by a 6-person jury and sentenced to 20 years in prison on May 11, 2012. Guess who was in charge of Alexander's prosecution? The very same Florida State Attorney, Angela B. Corey, who just sabotaged the George Zimmerman prosecution, denying Trayvon Martin justice. Lena Baker, the Black Panthers, Marissa Alexander, and Trayvon Martin all had the unconditional right to defend themselves. And not to be obstructed by U.S. gun control, which has never applied to racist cops and other armed bigots like George Zimmerman, who are free to hunt down and murder youth of color. They are the real fascists and terrorists of today's world.
I speak a little. So, peace significa organización de padres para mejorar el transporte escolar.
PIS means parents to improve school transportation. Okay.
Yo estoy aquí y me siento bien orgullosa de estar con todos ustedes.
Says I'm here and feel very proud to be among all of you.
Yo voy aparte de que represento a PIS,
Apart from representing PIS,
represento al Comité Timón de los Derechos en Puerto Rico.
I'm part of and I represent Comité Timón for rights, special education rights in Puerto Rico.
El Comité Timón ahora empieza oficialmente el capítulo desde este verano conmigo.
Officially, Comité Timón is starting a summer campaign
Junto con PIS.
together with PIS.
Hoy la importancia de la ley ADA
The importance of the ADA law
y siempre en las guaguas escolares
and the school bus
es que se respeten los derechos de los niños con impedimentos cuando se le dé la transportación,
is that they have to respect the rights of the children with disabilities when they give them transportation.
no se están respetando los derechos
They're not respecting those rights
de los niños en la guagua.
of the children who ride the bus.
El 1%
The 1%,
está violentando los derechos de estos niños y de todas las personas deshabilitadas.
the 1% is violating the rights of these children and of all people with disabilities.
Hicieron la ley, pero no la respetan.
They made the law, or we made the law, but they don't respect it.
Por eso, hoy más que nunca,
For this reason, today more than ever,
debemos estar todos unidos
we have to all be united
para que tanto niños como adultos y la población en general, especialmente la que tenemos impedimentos,
so that children, adults, and in general, everyone who has disabilities
respeten las leyes y se cumplan.
get the respect and that they meet what the law has said to do.
Le voy a hablar sobre la campaña que está llevando PIS.
We're going to speak about the campaign that PIST is working on now.
Una de las cosas que estamos haciendo es que nos entrevistamos en la Oficina de los Derechos Civiles
We went and had a meeting at the Office of Civil Rights of the U.S. Department of Education.
y sí se están violentando en la orientación que nos dieron.
They told us that yes, we have the right to make complaints about bus violations through that office.
Se están violentando los derechos de los niños en las guaguas.
They're violating rights of the children in the bus.
Por eso en septiembre
So in this September coming,
vamos a hacer la campaña más masiva,
we're going to have a more massive campaign
obligando y orientando a cada papá
letting and urging every parent
a que haga una querella en la Comisión de los Derechos Civiles
that whatever happens, they file these complaints, make the record with
por la transportación escolar.
about school transportation and what's being done wrong.
Okay. La manera en que se está violentando la ley de los niños en la guagua
some of the ways that the transportation rights of the bus children being violated.
Primero, no se está respetando la política que hay escrita dentro del departamento y dentro de las guaguas, no se está respetando la política que hay escrita en el Departamento de Educación.
We can point out that the Department of Education own policies that's written down, they're not following their own policy.
Y en los mismos trabajadores de la Unión y los que no son y los que no están en la Unión, la política escrita no la están respetando, están violentando los derechos que afectan a nuestros niños discapacitados.
And the workers that we know from the union, and some are not in the union, who drive and accompany the children on the bus will tell you the same. We communicate with them.
Por eso hoy me atrevo a anunciar aquí.
Oh, okay. So she's going to announce
Que en septiembre los resultados que estamos haciendo de la campaña de la guagua para que no se violenten más los derechos a nuestros niños.
we're going to really step up the campaign. We're going to catch them as soon as the school year begins.
Va a haber un pleito de clase.
We're working on a class action suit. We have lawyers.
Contra el 1%.
And it's really against the 1% because they're privatizing, making profits off the bus.
Otra de las cosas que estamos haciendo,
Another thing we're doing,
estamos impulsando una ley una ley que estamos que es de entrenamiento para los choferes, que ahora mismo el sistema
okay. There's a law in Albany that we're trying to push because it actually, for a change, had actual input from parents and disabled self-advocates about what the training should be for drivers and matrons on the bus. And the union supports it wholeheartedly as well.
Otra de las cosas, hay una manifestación del 29 de julio contra la conferencia de adjudicar las rutas de transporte escolar, que será a las 10:30.
Okay. The next, Monday after next, the 29th of July, there's another one of these bid conferences where they're trying to sell our children basically to the lowest bidder of the school bus that, are going to be promising poverty wages to the workers on the bus and rotten conditions and, the least attention to training and the most doubling up of routes. And we're going to demonstrate out there.
Otra de las cosas que estoy haciendo yo en mi persona para ayudar no solamente a mis hijos, sino a los niños discapacitados, hablando con políticos, entrando en sus campañas, sin identificarme con ninguno de ellos, para que aprueben la ley de la guagua, el IPP, y se respete la ley la ley ADA, los derechos civiles, no solamente de los niños, sino de las personas que tienen una incapacidad.
Okay, and another thing is that this is an election year in the city, so everybody's going to push and make sure that it's a campaign issue, that what's going on with the kids on the bus. And Milagros herself is, personally interviewing and hounding some of these politicians who promised that they would restore employee protection that was, robbed away from these routes that triggered a strike that we all suffered along with the workers.
Es importante que apoyemos el proyecto de ley de derecho de transporte escolar.
And we have an important campaign for a school bus bill of rights that we have in the back of how it should be run.
Esto no es solamente de las personas deshabilitadas, esto es de la comunidad entera. Tenemos que apoyar, tienen que buscar el apoyo de...
This is for everybody in the community, and we're looking for your support.
El apoyo de todo el mundo y que nos respeten a nosotros, las personas que tenemos una disabilidad, que no somos menos que nadie, somos más importantes y ellos no son nada sin nosotros.
That people with disabilities are not less than anybody. you know, they have to respect.
Ellos sin nosotros no son nada y no tienen trabajo, nosotros somos lo mejor y lo más importante. Después de Dios, nosotros somos las mejores personas, somos los mejores, donde debemos que nos respeten y obligarlos a que respeten y que nosotros sí estamos vivos, tenemos vida, somos personas especiales.
I'm gonna try. That, you know, we have to obligate the society to respect all of us because we're important, we're all special.
En mi vida como madre de 3 niños especiales
I'm a mother of 3 special children,
y la vida de activismo que tengo,
and I have an activist life.
para mí es muy importante,
It's very important for me.
es mucho trabajo,
Do a lot of work,
24 horas sin dormir,
even if it's 24 hours a day and I lose sleep.
todo por mis hijos y las otras personas que necesitan un granito día a día para contribuir a que este mundo sea mejor y que el 1% no nos humille más los derechos.
Okay, no, córtalo. Empieza. Wait. For my children and everybody to make a better world, not just for the 1%. Okay, más o menos. Okay.
Thank you.
From each according to our abilities, to each according to our needs. And that brings to mind an experience I had when I was teaching, working with little children in preschool. Parents would ask me, how do you discipline these terrible kids, you know? I said, well, each according to his abilities and each according to their needs. And I got quite a few eyebrows shot right up and a few sly grins too. But that's not really what I just thought of that when I saw that. When I'm going to, I'm sorry, I have to move you a little bit. Okay. When I agreed to talk about disability through my poems and writings, I afterwards wondered about the subject. You see, disability comes in many forms, shapes and sizes, some very obvious, others not so, but all have a base in the system that we live under. I have a few additions to add to the excellent list that we all received, such as homelessness, incarceration, obesity, old age, health, and people who fail to have a true understanding of life. So here are some of the comments on disabilities I would like to share with you. A homeless man. A homeless man lives in a van with 3 dogs and a cat. Man in a van on Carmine Street. What do you think of that? Every week he is harassed by those who like to kick ass. So what's the solution to his dilemma? He thinks there's none. I disagree. There certainly is. You don't have to be a whiz to know that the solution has got to be revolution. Okay. I'd like to preface this poem about prisoners, incarceration, with the fact that I go to a writing circle that is run by an ex-prisoner who was actually incarcerated for 10 years on a mistaken identity. He also teaches a group of prisoners. He monitors a group of prisoners in a writing circle there. And he told us about it and asked us to write something how we feel about this. So this is what I wrote. Why do we write? We have no choice. The words come gushing out even though we are surrounded by wire, by fences, by hacks who stand around looking to get our backs. Why do we write? We need to share the emptiness of life in here, the pain, no gain, the fear, the excitement, the longing for freedom, regretting what was, even though much was done for survival. We have survived, even in this hellhole. And can I have time for one more? Okay. This is about old age. One of the many poems I've written about old age. I wonder why. I think maybe it impacts me too. But anyway, I call it Elderly Woman. What do we think when we see an elderly woman shuffling down the street, not too steady on her feet, dressed in clothes that have seen many years of use, clothes that can be maybe too loose, reminiscent of a younger, fuller body, clothes that may not be adequate for the weather, a bitter expression on her face? Do we see the inadequate clothing as an indication of a meager income from Social Security now being threatened with extinction? Do we see the bitter face as a message of pain and disappointment, of a lifetime of struggle to survive, ending in subsistence? Or do we see her at all? That one gives me the goosebumps. Okay. I got some more lovelies, but I'll do those later.
Okay, we'd like to thank Joyce very much.